Okay, and finally, let's talk about climate change, a very important issue, perhaps the biggest environmental challenge facing our society today.
We know that the climate is changing as a result of human activities, particularly emissions of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. This plot shows us the levels of carbon dioxide in the Earth's atmosphere over the past thousands of years before today. And what we see is that the levels that we're experiencing today are higher than in any of this recorded history. So this is what's happened so far. Now what we need to decide as a society is where we go from here. And so scientists have projected, right, based on different decisions that we can make about how we're going to structure our society, how much we're going to continue using greenhouse gas, fossil fuels, et cetera, we may end up at any of these levels, right? If we do absolutely nothing, business as usual, we could wind up all the way up here, which would have really disastrous impacts for the planet. And so what we really have in front of us today is a decision about which of these paths we're going to set ourselves on going forward. It's also clear that the impacts of climate change will have wide-ranging effects on human health. And this figure kind of illustrates that by showing how different changes in the climate system at the center of this figure, from rising temperatures to extreme weather, rising sea levels, and increases in CO2 levels, impact different drivers of human health. For example, extreme heat can lead to heat-related illness and death. Air pollution interacts with the climate system in various ways. For example, we have more air pollution when we experience big wildfires, as we know very well here in Colorado. That has impacts on asthma and cardiovascular disease. As one more example, when we have environmental degradation, we can experience civil conflict and impacts on mental health. So lots and lots of impacts that reach, from sort of these changes in the climate out into various impacts on human health. And when we think about this challenge from the policy perspective, one of the things that's really fundamentally challenging is that we have a mismatch between the countries that have historically been responsible for creating the pollution that is driving climate change. So the European Union and the United States, for example, huge players in historical emissions that are driving what we have in the atmosphere today. Meanwhile, if we look at who's going to bear the impacts, who is and will continue to be bearing the impacts of climate change, we know that that hits poorer countries, countries that have been deprived of resources, countries that have experienced colonization, from sub-Saharan Africa to India, for example. And so those climate burdens, while they are experienced across the globe, are particularly going to be a burden for those lower income, under-resourced countries. And as another wrinkle, right, even though historically emissions have come from the more developed, the currently high income countries, as countries in what we sometimes refer to as the global south or lower income countries are trying to catch up and improve quality of life in much needed ways for their citizens, that also is coming with increased emissions in those areas. So now, currently today, China is the biggest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions. And so, this challenge of who's responsible both for what we've experienced in the past and, crucially, right, who should be bearing the costs and taking action to avoid future climate change is a very complicated policy challenge on an international, global scale. So given that it is this big international problem, there has been, kind of a long history of international policy action to address climate change. This began in 1992 with the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was ratified by 195 countries, including the US. In 1997, the Kyoto Protocol was negotiated. This mandated a reduction in carbon emissions below 1990 levels by 2012, However, this applied only to developed countries for some of the reasons that I outlined in the previous slides, in terms of this historical, who had contributed to the problem. President Clinton signed the agreement, but it wasn't ratified by Congress. And in 2001, after President Bush was elected, the US State Department rejected this protocol, and part of its rationale was that this would harm the US economy and that it, kind of quote unquote wasn't fair that developing countries whose emissions were growing were exempted. In 2012, there was an important set of amendments negotiated in Doha to the Kyoto Protocol. The US did not ratify that set of amendments. However, in 2005, we saw what has really been the most broad, sweeping international attempt to tackle the climate crisis, which is the Paris Agreement. So I'll share more about the details of the Paris Agreement in the next slide, but the political context to this was that the agreement was negotiated under President Obama, and the US had some planned commitments to reduce their emissions by 2025. Before he left office, Obama signed an executive order confirming the US adoption of the agreement, but didn't submit it to Congress. And in another example of this pendulum shift that we've highlighted throughout this lecture, when President Trump took office in 2017, he promptly withdrew the US from the Paris Climate Agreement. And then upon taking office, President Biden, one of his first acts, actually on his first day in office, was to recommit the US to withholding its commitments under the Paris Agreement. Paris Climate Agreement actually do? Well, the first thing it does is to agree, it's an agreement among the signatories to limit the average global temperature. So setting this goal of limiting the average global temperature increase to less than 2 degrees Celsius, and overall, right? So we're just going to say we're not going to go above that threshold, and trying to achieve net zero emissions, so no more basically stopping the growth in greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere by the middle of the current century, so by 2050. The second thing the Paris Climate Agreement does is puts in mechanisms to enhance resilience and adaptation to the climate impacts that are certain to occur. So recognizing, right, that no matter what we do at this point, climate change has already happened or is already happening. And so we're not going to be able to totally avoid any climate impacts. So we need to invest in resilience and adaptation measures. And finally, right, there's sort of some recognition that in order to do this, we need financial commitments. And as I showed before, right, this idea that we have countries who are historically responsible for this problem, right, and that part of the reason that developed countries, high-income countries, have high incomes is because we have had, a century or more of development that has been financed or supported by burning fossil fuels and creating this problem. And so those resources that high-income countries have, sort of need to be aligned and put towards this problem to tackle the climate crisis. In terms of the state of the Paris Agreement, so as of April of 2021, we have a large number of countries, the US again back in, and many, many countries who have ratified the Paris Agreement, including the US. So that's the good news. The slightly, more challenging news is that signing the agreement is one thing, enacting it, implementing it, and actually, taking action under the agreement to reduce emissions, that's really where the hard work is. And so this was an analysis, again, as of September of 2021, that sort of assesses where different countries are in terms of, are they on track to meet their goals and commitments under the Paris Agreement. And so, sobering to see that only one country, the small country of the Gambia in Africa, is completely on track Several countries are on a good path getting there, but a large number of countries, and I'm actually looking for, USA is in the insufficient, that middle category there, right? So there's still a lot of work to be done. And part of that work, again, is really tackling this financial part of it and aligning the resources and the flows of resources from richer to poorer countries to pay both for climate action and to pay for climate damage, right? To pay countries to rebuild after disasters, for example. So in November of 2022, during another set of negotiations, there's sort of these annual summits to continue the work of that Paris Climate Agreement. And so at the what's called the Conference of Parties, or the COP Summit in November of 2022, countries established what's called a loss and damage fund to provide compensation to vulnerable low-income nations for costs related to storms, heat waves, and droughts. So there was a committee that negotiated sort of the terms of this fund. But there's still a lot of details to continue to be working out. How should this fund be set up? Which countries will contribute? Where will the money go? And in terms of this, so there was some movement on this, but still work to be done in terms of the actual meat of making commitments and following through on those commitments to actually cut emissions. So what actually is U.S. climate policy? What have we been doing domestically to tackle this problem? It's important to note, again, that this, this really is one of these cases where the science has been clear for a very long time. And so this is a timeline that was actually presented as part of a lawsuit where some young people in the United States were suing the federal government over its climate inaction. And so what they are showing here, right, is that the evidence that climate change has actually been, is a problem that needs to be addressed, goes back potentially, to the 1950s, and if not earlier. And as noted before, the U.S. has had sort of an in and out role in terms of its engagement in federal or in international climate agreements. We did see at the very end of the Obama presidency sort of this unprecedented year of climate action. Lots and lots of, again, these are some links that you can look at. I know the type is small, so you probably can't read them, but lots that happened during that final year of Obama's presidency. Of course, as we've already discussed, things changed once Trump took office with action to quit the Paris Climate Agreement. But really was this, I think it's important to remember that there was a strong push-pull during this time as well. So, for example, Congress, making attempts to keep the U.S. in the agreement and continue to fulfill our commitments. EPA action, so across government to withdraw and replace some of the Obama-era policies with weaker environmental legislation. Including things like, trying to, push back on the state's ability to set stricter environmental standards, and then those actions being tied up in court. And so I think what we did see is that because, there was sort of so much that was attempted, a lot of this really did get held up in court in a way that I think, from sort of a climate action perspective, reduced some of the damages that could have happened at that time. And then meanwhile, emphasizing yet again that with Biden's presidency, the pendulum has swung in the opposite direction, and this commitment to rejoining the Paris Climate Accords and taking more aggressive action to tackle the climate crisis has really been front of the federal agenda. As a big important part of that, Justice 40 is one example of an executive action that is committing to environmental justice and investing some of, a good portion, 40% of government investments that are directed at things like increasing climate resilience, those going into disproportionately impacted communities. And so in terms of climate policy, substantively, what we've seen under President Biden is what has been referred to as this triple whammy. So there are three key pieces of legislation that actually have been passed and are being implemented that all tackle the climate crisis from different angles in a way that's really substantial and has a lot of promise for making a real difference. So these include the CHIPS and Science Act. So this reading here that I've shared calls this the brains of the operation. So this is putting a lot of money towards cutting edge research and development to accelerate innovation in emerging clean energy technologies. The second part of this push is the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the bipartisan infrastructure bill, as we've heard it called. This is really the backbone, providing the infrastructure that these technologies will need to scale up at speed. And finally, the Inflation Reduction Act, which is sort of this engine driving investment growth through these different demand pull measures. So incentives, for example, for purchasing electric vehicles as one example, right? And so if we look at, for example, the spending on climate, we've just seen this really massive scale up that I think holds a lot of promise. So to conclude, what are some of the successes, challenges, and what does the road ahead look like for US environmental health policy? We have some really good news to share, and it's important, right, to celebrate these successes and win the wins. So through the action, starting way back in the 1970s and even earlier, we've seen legislation that's created better air and cleaner water in very measurable ways. Many, many, many lives have been saved by these massive pieces of legislation that have happened. And it is very exciting to share that, climate action is finally happening. The US really is doing that. We are part of a global community that is taking those actions, and there is real promise that the worst impacts of the climate crisis will be averted if we can stay this path. There are some challenges that we really have to pay attention to when it comes to environmental policy. Our systems that have been set up do a really good job of sort of looking at pollutant by pollutant from particular point sources and addressing those. But there are significant sources of pollution, for example, runoff from agriculture. That's what's called a non-point source. And as we highlighted before, the Clean Water Act doesn't have great systems set up to address those sources in the way that it does, what's coming out of a drain pipe from an industry source. Similarly, the challenges of environmental racism and environmental injustice are really pervasive. And again, it's been promising to see the attention to these issues from the federal government and at many levels. Again, I've highlighted that Colorado is really leading in this area. But there's significantly more work to do. And it does, often feel, I think communities feel like their voices are heard when it's convenient or when it serves the benefits of more affluent, whiter communities, for example. But really seeing that follow through and that commitment to implementing environmental justice is something that we need to keep our eyes on for sure. Similarly to what I noted earlier, right, looking at, and these things are kind of tied together, the cumulative impacts. So setting up ways of really understanding and regulating not just one individual point source of pollution, but really looking at as a whole, what are communities experiencing, what are they exposed to, and how can we create policies that better protect all of our communities and reduce the burdens across all of our communities. And so, as we have talked about many times in this class, we need all of us here in public health, as well as, across multiple partnerships, to be engaged and informed advocates, participants in our democracy at all different levels and in the policy process to continue to make these improvements. And I just wanted to end with another piece of good news that I think is just showing the promise of this fight. Recently, a group of youth in Montana won a ruling that basically says that companies have to take into consideration the impacts of climate change. That needs to be a part of the environmental regulation and permitting processes. And so I think this is promising, right? These are the kinds of actions and advocates that we need, and that will continue to be making improvements in U.S. environmental health policy.